I'm doing it. If you don't tell, I'm not your boyfriend anymore. So guess what? She told. And at 17, custody was reversed 10 years later. How do you think she got along with her mother at that point in time? It was not an easy haul, but they've made it. They've made it and become very close. Why did the cases turn around? This is what you want to know, and this is what you want to happen if you're in one that has not yet turned around. Appeals worked, but not exclusively. Many of these cases, appeals were lost, and they turned around anyway for reasons. One of the most powerful reasons was a new evaluation done of the child with a new disclosure when the new evaluation is done by a specialist in child abuse or domestic violence. The first time around, the mental health evaluators who recommended custody with the abusers had no specific training in child abuse and no training in domestic violence. But at time two, there was significant suffering that these children had suffered. They had suicidal ideation, dissociation, anxiety, depression. Some had multiple physical injuries that were still healing. One of our children had a near lethal suicide attempt. Child Protective Service findings were largely irrelevant to the final outcome. Whether Child Protective Services founded it or unfounded it didn't seem to matter. The judges made decisions based on the recommendations of the mental health professionals. The GALs, the guardian ad litems, almost exclusively sided with the abusive fathers in our cases. Child pornography possessed by fathers in over 20% of the cases was ignored at time one by the judges. In one of the judicial decisions, the judge said, well, there were only 2 pictures, so I didn't really make much of it. 1 picture is against the law. I'm going to show you some of the writing from 2 of the turned around cases, and you can see the drama, and you can see the stupidity of the evaluators at time one. She appears to lack insight into the strong feelings and motivations that are driving her behavior, casting Dad as child abuser. She's become obsessed and fixated upon her negative campaign to denigrate the father, regardless of the negative impact. She evidences narcissistic personality traits. She has a sense of entitlement. She's willing to exploit others to achieve her own ends. She lacks empathy. She can't form relationships. Mother lost this child at the age of 5. The turnaround, age 12. Child has consistently discussed a history of sexualized contact by her father since early childhood, and the information that she has given has never wavered. These include being forced to sleep with her father for several years without having her own bed, having to bathe with him, having contact with his penis with a washcloth, remembering having her limbs tied while undressed, and her father kissing her bottom, and remembering her father touching her genital area. The new therapist who filed with the court an immediate emergency motion when the child was 12 was followed by an immediate termination of parental rights. From the years of 5 to 12, the child suffered in this environment because of this psychologist's condemnation of this mother. Another one. Mother has no insight into how her behavior alienates the child from the father, how her behavior creates the problem in the child she complains about. Her enmeshment and lack of control of her child's behavior is harmful. Mother lost access to her son at age 6. The turnaround, age 10. Disclosure to the FBI. The grand jurors, duly impaneled and sworn upon their oath, present that so-and-so did intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly engage in unlawful sexual penetration of a child. So far, I've analyzed 27 of my 60 cases. They're filled with custody evaluator errors, misunderstanding of domestic violence, history of adjudicated domestic violence being ignored, reliance on parental alienation as a philosophy to explain or cover up symptoms of abuse. Let's listen to one of the confessions of an abuser in jail. Did you ever use a child custody dispute to make a report of your crime seem not credible? Oh yes. I tried to say my ex-wife was making this crime up so she could get custody of my son. I said she knew I would get custody of our son, so she had to make me look bad. What did you do when your crime was reported to convince people you did not commit the crime? I recruited people by trying to put down and discount my ex-wife's credibility. I would bring up all her faults. I didn't try to convince people that my son was lying. I tried to say they were only saying what my ex-wife told them to say. I would put all the blame on her. That would keep them from thinking that I was lying, because I was molesting my own son. Does this sound familiar? Out of the horse's mouth. Child Protective Services ends up being totally useless in these cases in the manner in which the business is being conducted currently. We know that less than 0.1% of cases are purposefully made false allegations. Yet, this is from a state training manual from Pennsylvania. Anybody here from Pennsylvania? Okay. The state training manual says that this is how you can tell a purposefully false allegation. Custody dispute, history of multiple referrals, alleged perpetrator claims it's false, and the lack of medical or physical evidence. If they had read any of the newest scientific literature, they would know that their training manual for their state guidelines is faulty. Not only that, but they mention the goals of their state training are to identify the steps in the intake and investigation process, identify the legal, regulatory, and standards for child welfare practice, and then two more. Recognize the phenomenon of unreliable and knowingly false accusations, which is less than 0.1% of all cases. Recognize the indicators of knowingly false reports. That was this list, which is faulty. Half of the training goals are to focus on a phenomenon that's less than 1.1% of the population of children that they are being asked to protect. Here's a picture drawn by a child whose case did get turned around. The picture is dramatic and clear. It shows clearly what her dad was doing to her. When the investigators investigated the case, they said they considered this picture physical evidence because the bed in which she said this rape occurred had the giant sunflowers on it that she drew in her picture at the age of 8. This was her 8th report to CPS. She had been telling reports since the age of 2. We found some excellent judges in our work. The recantations saying they lied are not believable. It is far more plausible the children lost hope and adopted an official view. That evaluator bought into the parental alienation thing and accepts recantations as fait accompli. Yet there's no persuasive evidence of coaching. It is important to acknowledge that exposing children to family violence is child abuse, stated beautifully by a Maryland judge. Abusers will use any means to gain control of the situation. They may use visitation as a means of control and harassment. So I asked one of my little clients who is a part of this turned around case sample why he wanted to be a judge. He told me he wanted to be a judge when he grew up. So I said, when you are a judge, will you listen to kids who say they are abused? And little Billy answered me, no, I won't. I will listen to the evidence. Why do we have to learn from children? What can we do? Federal oversight hearings, guidance for child state welfare, law enforcement collaboration. Is there any role for custody evaluations? I don't know, but we'll be discussing that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Hara McLeod. I wish I could say that I had a prepared speech for you today, but unfortunately I'm a victim of the government shutdown and I've been furloughed, so I've been a little distracted as of late. I wish I could stand here today and say that I had a happy story for everyone of a case that had been turned around, but unfortunately in my situation and my son's situation, my case didn't last long enough for it to have been turned around. Some of you in this room are aware of what happened to my son, Prince McLeod. I'm going to leave the second last name off for obvious reasons. About a year ago, on October 20th, my son was drowned by his father on his 4th unsupervised visit. I fought for 15 months before that to try to limit the access to supervised visits or no visits, but unfortunately, I lost that battle. I'm not standing here today for myself. I'm standing here on behalf of my son because he can't be here himself. we're facing a crisis here in American history. There were members of my family hundreds of years ago that didn't have civil rights in this country, and they weren't considered people. We call them slaves. At a time in our U.S. history, women also didn't have rights and weren't viewed as equal people. Today, I think a lot of times we take for granted the basic civil rights that we have as adults. And what I have learned through this system and through what has happened to me and my family is that children don't have civil rights in this country. Some of you may have read in the Washington Post this weekend, there was an editorial, and one of the most powerful parts of that editorial, to me, said that the courts believe that parents have a constitutional right to raise their children. I had full custody of my son, physical and legal custody of my son. It didn't matter. I wasn't given civil rights to raise my son because part of raising a child is being able to protect them. And I was not allowed to protect my son. But at the end of the day, I would have put my civil rights on the table if it meant that my son could have some. Because after all of this, the courts gave me some civil rights, at least I had custody, but the courts did nothing for my son. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, I don't stand here as a turnaround case. My son was also a victim of a mental health professional who came into court, and despite the history that this man had been living off of the Social Security death benefits and the life insurance from two people who had been brutally murdered before, this professional stood up in front of the court and talked about how he should have access to his son and how he was safe to be around him. This mental health professional was also a school psychologist whose background was in child autism. And so as I sit here today, I think to myself, well, my son's father didn't have autism, and he wasn't a child. I don't know why. I don't know why she was put in that position to make that determination. 2 weeks before my son died, I found myself in my attorney's office, crying, screaming, probably looking like a basket case because I was. And I asked them, please file an emergency order to keep him in Maryland. At the time, my son was peacefully sleeping in his stroller. He had no idea what was going on. And my attorneys laughed at me and they said, if you don't stop fighting, you're going to lose custody. You need to learn to appreciate what this man can offer your child. And I said, well, please educate me because I'm not exactly sure what that is at this moment. And they told me that he was a mastermind at manipulation, and that was a good skill to have. 2 weeks later, I was in the hospital. This is before I knew that my son had been murdered. And I called my attorney and I said, it's happened again. What do I do? And this was a Saturday, and he said, well, calm down, don't worry, on Monday we'll file an emergency order. I called back 2 hours after I had been told that my son was brain dead, and I said, don't worry about that emergency order, he's dead. Monday morning was when my son had an autopsy. On January 25th, his father was arrested when authorities got the information from the medical examiner that he had been drowned. About a week after, right around the same time, they released the information that he had taken out more than $580,000 in life insurance on my son when he was only 3 months old. So for 15 months, I spent my entire time with my son fighting to save him. My son's father spent that 15 months trying to get access to him so he could drown him and get money from it. So I stand here today and I plead with you to think about the real issue here. It's not about the rights of a father. It's not about the rights of a mother. It's about the right of a child.
Karen, my thoughts and prayers are with you and your family. When one angel leaves, it's wonderful how God sends another. Can we give her another round of applause? Good morning. My name is Donette Lepore. and I would like to start by giving thanks and honor to God. Had it not been for him, I would not be where I am today. Second, I would like to recognize and give thanks to Connie Valentine, who's my shero, and she is a trailblazer. Also, Mr. Ron LeGrand for taking the time away from his busy schedule to meet with the mothers of lost children. And I want to acknowledge all the mothers here who are still fighting for their children. Thank you. Connie said I have 10 minutes to sum up 10 years. So here it goes. I am a mother of 2 beautiful children who I love dearly. My son is now 22. He was taken at the age of 9. My daughter is 16, and she was taken at the age of 3. I was married to an abusive police officer detective who was able to hide behind the badge. Not only was he abusive to my children and myself, but come to find out, he had a long history of abuse. I sought help from the mayor, the chief of police, the district attorney, the FBI, my congressman, my senator, U.S. Department of Justice, professional organizations, nonprofits, and of course, the family court. All to no avail. The straw that broke the camel's back was when my son was hospitalized with pneumonia. My ex came to the hospital and caused a scene in front of my sick son. Later, he threatened my life, and at that point, I knew I had to leave. My children and I had been through enough, and we had seen enough. I went to family court for relief. Instead, the court refused to help me, took custody away from me, and handed my children over to their abusive father, despite the fact that my ex stated in his own words to the custody evaluator that he did not want primary custody of the children. And I have an excerpt from that evaluation, and I quote, "Father again commented that he hoped to be given shared custody of the children, and he made the point that he did not want to have their primary custody." Guess what? He was given primary physical custody. I was placed on supervised visits for 8 years, denied the right to go to my daughter's first day of school, denied educational access, denied any type of constitutional parental involvement in my children's lives. My rights vanished and gone. My son suffered most of the abuse at the hands of his abusive father. I would travel 5 hours to have supervised visits with my children. Supervised visits for a protective mother is a nightmare. But the good thing about a nightmare is you wake up. The painful look in my children's eyes is one a mother will never forget. Helpless and hopeless. "Mommy, can you help me? Save me. I don't want to be here. Why are we here? Why did you leave? I don't want to live with Dad." Helpless and hopeless. My court order read, quote, "Do not discuss the children residing with you in the future," end unquote. There was an incident where I was on a phone with my son. My ex ordered my son to get off the phone with me. My ex thought the phone was hung up, but I remained on a line and was able, unfortunately, to listen to the act of abuse imposed upon my son. I called Child Protective Services and made the report and sent the evidence. It was all covered up and nothing was done to help my son. Case closed. Why? Our children deserve to be protected. They are not property. They have every right under the Constitution to be protected. I released 5 lawyers for failure to uphold the oath they took before practicing law. One said, and I quote, "I still have to live here and practice law in this county." His excuse for not helping my children? Frustrated and dismayed, I decided to represent myself for 3 years against a seasoned lawyer, me, a layperson, an advocate for my children, out of money and out of time, but not out of love. Finally, in 2008, I regained custody back of my 2 children, my son 17 and my daughter 11. How? My ex died in a single car accident. When I regained custody of my children, they came to live with me. My son was not the same child he was when I had him. My son had a permanent smile, full of love, joy, and laughter, and had a spark in his eye. Now, it's all gone. His emotional state was and is challenged. He's very angry and at times delusional. The brainwashing and the abuse affected his way of thinking, his life, his learning, and his health. I would like to leave you with a few things. 1, ordinary citizens, i.e. protective mothers, do not have investigative powers to the problems of the higher problems in this land. 2, our children are the future. Look around you. They deserve to flourish and grow as children, not as raped and abused children by those who have legal access to them. 3, if you think that child abuse doesn't affect you, your family, or your home, think again. Your child may be in school with another child who is disrupting class. Drugs introduced to your children from abused children. Crimes committed by adults who were abused as children. Abuse is in the news every day. I can go on and on about this conversation, but now it's time to investigate the national evidence and act. We are lacking oversight and accountability in the area of child abuse and neglect. Why? You may all ask, what can Congress or DOJ do? I received a letter back in 2003 when I thought I was the only mom who was going through this from the U.S. Department of Justice, which I had multiple layers in my case. And based on that, here's an excerpt from the letter written to a prominent civil rights leader on my behalf. Quote, "We have carefully considered the information you provided and reviewed our records of complaints against police departments and local press reports for the past few years to determine whether a full pattern and practice investigation is warranted. However, at this time, we do not have sufficient evidence to open a full pattern and practice investigation. Thank you for writing to the Civil Rights Division about this matter. Please do not hesitate to contact us again should you wish to provide us with any additional information regarding any other matter. Donna Murphy, Deputy Chief." On October 12, 2011, Makers of Memories Foundation participated in a special congressional briefing on Capitol Hill to educate policymakers, leaders, the public about children affected by domestic violence. Here's an excerpt from the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. John Conyers, and I applaud Mr. John Conyers. Quote, "I, John Conyers, call for an oversight hearing to access where we are in our work on the impact of domestic violence on children and what can and should be done. 2 congressional colleagues, Representative Gwen Moore, and Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, also called for more action from the federal government. Following months of collaboration with colleagues in more than 20 local and national advocacy organizations, I will introduce this month a violence